It was a warm, sunny afternoon when the train rattled into the station, spewing steam and metallic clanks as it slowed to a halt. The platform was bustling with the usual mix of travelers, men in crisp suits rushing for business meetings, families on holiday, and laborers heading home after a long day. Among them was a well-dressed man, Professor Rajesh Sharma, who stood out with his neatly combed hair, rimmed glasses, and an air of intellect that was hard to ignore. He adjusted his briefcase and stepped into the train carriage, looking for an empty seat. He was on his way to a conference in the city where he was to present a paper on modern education techniques. The carriage he entered was modest but clean, with wide windows that overlooked the rolling countryside. Wooden seats lined either side, creaking under the weight of travelers who had already claimed their spots. The professor walked down the aisle until he found a seat next to an elderly farmer, who wore simple, worn clothes and a straw hat that had seen better days. The farmer's face was weathered, with deep lines etched by years of toiling under the sun. His eyes, however, were bright and alert, scanning the green fields that whizzed past as the train started moving again. Professor Sharma sat down, placing his briefcase on his lap and pulling out a thick book. He glanced at the farmer, who seemed lost in thought, staring out of the window with a content smile. The professor felt a tinge of amusement. What could this farmer possibly know about the world outside his fields? Surely, he thought, their lives were as different as night and day. As the train picked up speed, the rhythmic sound of the wheels created a soothing backdrop. Passengers shifted in their seats, some nodding off while others struck up conversations. The professor soon found himself feeling restless. He was accustomed to intellectual debates and lively discussions, and sitting in silence was beginning to bore him. An idea came to him. Perhaps he could engage the farmer in a game, something to pass the time and maybe even earn a little amusement. A small smile crept across his face as he turned to his travel companion. "Good day, sir," the professor said, his tone friendly but with a hint of condescension. The farmer looked at him and tipped his hat politely. "Good day," the farmer replied, his voice deep and steady. To make this journey more entertaining, the professor continued, "I propose a game. A game of questions, if you will. We ask each other questions in turn. If you cannot answer my question, you owe me 50 rupees, and if I cannot answer yours, I will give you 100 rupees. He leaned back confidently, sure that he was offering the farmer a fair deal. After all, what could a simple farmer know compared to a university professor? The farmer chuckled softly, a sound that seemed to come from deep within. He was no fool. He knew that the man beside him likely had more formal education than he could ever dream of. Yet, life on the farm had taught him lessons no classroom could. He looked into the professor's eyes and saw the challenge there. Why not? The stakes were not so high for him, and he was always up for some fun. He nodded slowly. "All right, professor, I'll play your game. But let me make a small request," the farmer said. "Since you are an educated man and I am but a humble farmer, if I fail to answer, I'll pay you 50 rupees. But if you, the learned one, cannot answer my question, you must pay me 100 rupees. The professor's eyes gleamed, convinced he was about to embark on a game that he was sure to win. "I accept," he said. The train swayed as it sped along the tracks, and a few passengers nearby, sensing the beginning of an interesting exchange, leaned in to listen. The farmer, with a twinkle in his eye, spoke first. "All right, here's my question," he said, pausing for dramatic effect. "What is it that walks on two legs when on the ground but when it flies, it has three legs?" The professor blinked, momentarily stunned by the question's absurdity. His mind raced, flipping through pages of knowledge in his head. Was it some sort of bird? A mythical creature? A riddle from folklore? He glanced at the farmer, who sat patiently, his expression unreadable. The minutes ticked by, and the professor's confidence began to wane as he realized he couldn't find an answer. With a sigh, he admitted defeat. "I don't know," he said, reaching into his wallet and handing over a crisp 100-rupee note. The farmer took it with a polite nod, tucking it safely into his shirt pocket. The professor, unable to bear the mystery any longer, leaned forward. "All right, now you must tell me the answer. What is it that walks on two legs when on the ground but has three legs when it flies?" The farmer smiled, reached into his pocket, and handed the professor 50 rupees. "I don't know either," he said, his eyes dancing with mischief. The air inside the carriage seemed to vibrate with laughter as the farmer's clever response sank in. The professor sat in stunned silence for a moment, staring at the 50-rupee note in his hand. He felt the heat rise to his cheeks, a mix of embarrassment and amusement fighting for dominance. Around them, a few passengers who had been eavesdropping chuckled quietly, casting knowing glances at the farmer. The man in the simple hat had outwitted the learned professor, and everyone could sense it. Professor Sharma's pride was pricked, but he couldn't help admiring the farmer's quick thinking. He knew he had walked into this game believing it would be easy to outsmart his fellow traveler. Instead, he had just learned a valuable lesson in humility. He pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, adjusted his posture, and took a deep breath. He couldn't let this end here. His curiosity, more potent than his bruised ego, urged him to know more about this intriguing farmer. "You are a clever man, my friend," the professor said, his voice tinged with genuine admiration. "I didn't expect that twist." The farmer's face softened into a smile, not the mocking grin of someone reveling in victory, but a kind smile that reflected understanding. He nodded as if to say that he had been underestimated before and was used to surprising people. The professor shifted in his seat, now intrigued beyond the game. Who was this man who could think so unconventionally? He decided to dig a little deeper, hoping to unravel the mystery. "Tell me," Professor Sharma said, leaning forward, "how did you come up with such a riddle? It doesn't seem like a question one learns from books or even hears in common conversations." The farmer glanced out of the window, the scenery outside now a blur of green fields, rustling trees, and distant hills. The golden sunlight filtered in, casting warm patterns on the wooden floor of the train. For a moment, the professor thought he wouldn't answer. But then, the farmer spoke, his voice thoughtful and calm. "Professor, life on the farm teaches you to look at things differently. Every day is filled with challenges that require a kind of wisdom that can't be found in books. Sometimes, when you don't know the answer, you learn to think outside of what is logical or expected." The professor's eyes widened slightly. The farmer spoke with a simplicity that belied a deeper understanding. The professor realized that his education had been confined to books, lectures, and theories, while the farmer's education had been written in sweat, soil, and life's unpredictability. The professor took a moment to digest this revelation. He was reminded of the countless times he'd stood in front of students, emphasizing that intelligence could be measured only by exams and academic achievements. Yet here was this man, with no formal education, who had effortlessly turned the tables on him. "Do you play these games often?" the professor asked, half joking, though his eyes betrayed his genuine interest. The farmer chuckled, the deep sound resonating in the small space. "Not often, Professor, but now and then, when the moment calls for it. My father used to say that a good riddle can teach a man more than 100 lectures because it forces him to look beyond the obvious." The professor nodded, his respect for the farmer growing. He couldn't remember the last time someone had managed to challenge him in such an unexpected way. The people in the carriage had settled back into their conversations or dozed off again, the brief moment of shared laughter fading into the background noise of the train. Yet, for the professor, this encounter was far from over. He looked at the countryside stretching beyond the train, the green fields punctuated by patches of wildflowers, the occasional farmer in the distance working the land, bent with focus. Suddenly, these sights, so familiar and often overlooked, took on new meaning. Each farmer out there, much like his companion, likely held stories, secrets, and wisdom that he, a man of books, would never fathom without listening. The professor turned back to the farmer. "Your father was a wise man," he said. The farmer's eyes grew a little misty, and he nodded. "Yes, he was. He taught me that everyone has something to teach, no matter who they are or where they come from. The trick is to recognize that wisdom when it appears." The train's whistle blew, signaling an approaching station. The hum of conversations picked up as passengers gathered their belongings, preparing to disembark. The professor felt a pang of regret that this journey would end soon. He had come expecting a monotonous ride, his mind set on rehearsing the lecture he would give. Instead, he found himself reevaluating long-held beliefs. "Thank you for the game and for teaching me today," Professor Sharma said, a genuine smile crossing his face. The farmer shook his head, tipping his hat once more. We teach each other, Professor. And sometimes, the best lessons are the ones we don't expect. As the train slowed to a stop, the professor knew this brief encounter would linger in his mind for days, if not longer. Life had a way of humbling those who thought they knew it all, and today, life had come in the form of a farmer with a riddle. The train lurched to a stop at a small, countryside station, its wheels squealing as if to protest the brief pause. A few passengers disembarked, bags in hand, while others climbed aboard, looking for any available seat. Professor Sharma, however, barely noticed the commotion. He was still absorbed in the conversation with the farmer, the man whose simple riddle had stirred thoughts and questions that now bounced around his mind. A breeze swept through the open window, carrying with it the scent of fresh earth and wildflowers. The farmer turned his gaze back to the window, watching as a young boy chased a dog along the platform, both full of laughter and energy. The professor took a moment to study the man beside him, trying to piece together what kind of life he must have lived. How had he learned to think so cleverly? What stories did he carry in those deep, wise eyes? The farmer seemed to sense the professor's silent questions and broke the silence with a chuckle. Thinking deeply again, Professor? He asked, amusement glinting in his eyes. You've got the look of a man trying to solve a puzzle that has no pieces. Professor Sharma smiled sheepishly. You could say that. You've piqued my curiosity. It's rare that I meet someone who makes me question what I know, or think I know. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Tell me, how did you come to be so good at these games of the mind? It's clear this isn't your first time playing. The farmer shifted in his seat, folding his arms as if wrapping himself in the warmth of old memories. Well, Professor, life on the farm is a game of wits more than anything else. You wake up every day with no guarantees. Will the rains come? Will the crops grow? Will the market give you a fair price? You learn to think on your feet, to adapt, and sometimes, to find joy in the small victories that others overlook. The professor nodded, realizing that this man's world was not so different from his own. He, too, had spent years preparing lessons, adapting to the challenges of academia, navigating a world of uncertainties. Yet, he had always measured intelligence by diplomas, certificates, and scholarly articles, never considering that wisdom could also be measured by the sun-scorched fields and calloused hands of a farmer. Take that riddle I asked you, the farmer continued, a hint of pride in his voice. It came to me one day as I was watching an old crow try to carry a stick too large for its beak. It would hobble along the ground on its two legs, but when it took off, it stretched its wings and balanced the stick like it had grown a third leg. Made me laugh so much, I decided to turn it into a question I could share. The professor raised an eyebrow, astonished at the simplicity of it all. The farmer's mind worked in a different, more vivid way, drawing connections from the world around him rather than textbooks and academic theories. It was a lesson in perception, how two people could look at the same world but see entirely different things. As the train pulled out of the station, its rhythmic rumble filled the silence that followed. The countryside blurred past them, the afternoon sun casting long shadows that danced across the seats. The professor felt a shift within himself, as though he were a student once again, learning from a teacher he never expected. Perception, the professor said finally, breaking the quiet. That's what it all comes down to, doesn't it? How we see the world and what we choose to learn from it. The farmer's eyes lit up with agreement. Exactly, Professor. To one man, a field is just a place to grow crops. To another, it's a lesson in patience, in respect for the land, in the resilience it takes to survive. And to someone like you, a train ride can be a chance to prove your knowledge or a chance to learn something new. Professor Sharma felt a strange lightness in his chest. The way the farmer spoke, it was as if he had read the professor's mind and knew the journey that had brought him to this moment. He thought back to his own students, bright-eyed and eager but often trapped in a single way of thinking, as he had been. Would he be able to teach them this broader view, this idea that learning came not just from books, but from the world itself? He turned to the farmer, his face full of gratitude. Thank you for this conversation, my friend. You've given me much to think about, more than you probably realize. The farmer waved a hand dismissively but smiled nonetheless. Life teaches us all, Professor. I've learned just as much from this chat. Next time you're on a train, I hope you'll remember it's not just a way to get from one place to another. Sometimes, It's a chance to change the way you see everything. The train sped on, cutting through fields now bathed in the golden glow of late afternoon. The professor leaned back, a content smile playing on his lips. This encounter had become more than a simple game. It had become a lesson on the power of perception, taught by a man who had no formal education but carried more wisdom than many professors combined. And as the miles slipped by, Professor Sharma knew this train ride would forever change the way he approached not just his work, but life itself. The afternoon sun cast its golden hues over the landscape, draping the passing fields in a warm, amber glow. The train continued its journey, winding through the countryside as the rhythmic clatter of wheels filled the carriage. Professor Sharma sat quietly, the farmer's words echoing in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt a shift in his thinking, a crack in the fortress of academic certainty he had spent decades building. It wasn't that he was any less confident in his education, but he now understood its limits and the power of insights that lay outside its bounds. The professor's eyes drifted from the window to the farmer, who sat with an air of quiet contentment. The lines on his weathered face seemed softer, lit by the glow of the sun as it spilled through the window. He watched as the farmer took out a small cloth bag and opened it to reveal a few dried fruits. Noticing the professor's glance, the farmer smiled and extended his hand. "Care for some?" the farmer offered, his voice gentle. Professor Sharma, taken aback by the simple generosity, reached out and took a piece. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying more than just gratitude for the snack. They carried a newfound respect. The two sat in companionable silence for a while, chewing on the dried fruits as the scenery rolled by. The fields outside were dotted with workers, bending and moving in the dance of daily labor. The professor thought about how, in his lectures, he often spoke about the economic significance of agriculture, quoting statistics and theories. Yet, he realized, he had never truly understood the life of the farmer, the resilience, the quiet battles with nature, and the simple joys that kept them going. "So, Professor," the farmer said, breaking the silence, "what do you teach at the university?" Professor Sharma chuckled softly, a little embarrassed now at how he had once taken such pride in the weight of his position. "I teach philosophy and literature," he replied. "I spend most of my days discussing ideas, analyzing stories, and teaching my students to think critically." The farmer nodded, a thoughtful look in his eyes. "Stories and ideas, those are important. My father used to say that the best stories are the ones that leave you seeing the world differently. Do you have a favorite story you tell your students?" The question was simple, but it caught the professor off guard. He thought about the countless lectures he had given, filled with stories from ancient texts, epics, and modern novels. But today, none of those seemed adequate. The story that came to mind was not from a book, but from the experience he had just lived. "I think my favorite story right now," the professor began slowly, "is about a professor who thought he knew everything there was to know about intelligence and wisdom. One day, he meets a farmer on a train, who teaches him more with a single question than he'd learned from any of his books. The farmer's eyes twinkled with recognition, a soft laugh escaping his lips. "Sounds like a story worth telling," he said. "Maybe your students will find that they have more in common with that professor than they'd like to admit." The train took a gentle curve, and the sun dipped lower, casting long, playful shadows across the fields. The professor felt a sudden urge to do more than just ponder. What he had learned, he wanted to share it, to bring this newfound perspective to his classroom, to challenge his students not just to learn, but to see, to truly see the world around them, in all its complexity and beauty. "Tell me," the professor said, shifting in his seat, "what is the hardest lesson you've learned as a farmer?" The farmer's smile faded a little as his gaze turned inward, searching for an answer in the depths of memory. After a pause, he spoke, his voice tinged with the wisdom of someone who had seen both joy and sorrow. "The hardest lesson," he said slowly, "is learning that you can do everything right, plant at the right time, tend to the crops with care, pray for rain, and still come up short. Nature has its way, and sometimes, despite all your efforts, things don't go as planned. It teaches you patience and humility. It makes you appreciate the good days and take the bad ones as part of the journey." The professor's chest tightened at the simplicity of the lesson, a truth that resonated beyond the fields. It was a lesson not just for farmers, but for anyone trying to navigate life's uncertainties. He thought of the times he had stood at the front of a lecture hall, confident that his well-prepared syllabus would guide his students to understanding. Yet, life often took unexpected turns, requiring adaptability, acceptance, and the grace to keep going even when the outcome was uncertain. "I think that's a lesson many people need to hear," the professor said, his voice quieter now. "In the university, we often speak of resilience and perseverance, but hearing it from someone who lives it is different." The farmer nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Words from books can guide you, but they don't teach you to walk through a storm. Experience does that." The train began to slow once more as it approached the next station. This time, both men sat in silence, savoring the shared understanding that had grown between them. The professor glanced at the station sign as it came into view and knew his stop was coming soon. But as the train rolled forward, he felt lighter, as if he were leaving with more than he had brought on board. The lessons, after all, weren't confined to the classroom. Some of the most profound ones could be learned from a farmer on a train, in the riddle of a crow, or in the way the land spoke through those who listened. The train's brakes screeched as it began to slow, the gentle sway of the carriage turning more abrupt. The sound of shuffling feet and rustling bags filled the air as passengers readied themselves to disembark. Professor Sharma looked at the sign of the upcoming station, his stop. The realization brought with it a pang of regret. This journey, which he had thought would be just another mundane trip, had turned into a chapter of self-reflection and newfound insight. It wasn't easy to walk away from a conversation that had altered the course of his thoughts so profoundly. He glanced over at the farmer, who was adjusting the cloth around his bundle of belongings, preparing to stay on the train for a few more stops. The sun, now dipping toward the horizon, bathed the carriage in hues of orange and gold, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out and mingle with the two travelers' paths. "I suppose this is where we part ways," Professor Sharma said, a touch of reluctance in his voice. The farmer looked up, his eyes warm and understanding. "Every journey must have its stops, Professor. But the lessons we learn along the way, those stay with us." The professor extended his hand, and in spoken acknowledgement of respect and gratitude. "You've given me more to think about than any book I've read in years." "Thank you." The farmer's rough hand grasped the professor's with surprising strength. "And you've reminded me, Professor, that everyone sees the world a bit differently, but there's always common ground if we look for it." The train finally halted, and with a nod, the professor grabbed his worn leather bag and stood up. He hesitated, turning back one last time. "I hope our paths cross again one day." The farmer smiled, a gleam of mischief returning to his eyes. "Perhaps with a new riddle next time, one even you can't resist." The professor chuckled, shaking his head as he stepped off the train and onto the platform. The cold, solid ground under his feet felt different somehow, as if he were standing on more than just cement but a new understanding. He watched as the train began to roll away, the farmer's silhouette visible through the window until it was just a dot in the distance. The platform was alive with the usual bustle, vendors shouting out their wares, children laughing, and the sharp whistle of trains arriving and departing. Yet, for Professor Sharma, everything seemed quieter, softer. He turned and started to walk toward the exit, each step feeling lighter than the last. His mind was already planning how he would approach his next class. Gone were the plans for a lecture heavy with theory and rote memorization. Instead, he would start with a story, one about a farmer, a riddle, and the idea that wisdom comes from unexpected places. He envisioned asking his students questions that would push them to think beyond their textbooks. He would challenge them to see the world not just as it was described to them but as they experienced it themselves. For too long, he realized, he had focused solely on teaching them what to think. Now, he wanted to teach them how to think, to look at life's complexities through a lens that welcomed curiosity and diverse perspectives. As he passed through the station's exit, he paused for a moment, watching the orange sun as it slipped behind the horizon. The day was ending, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose that would carry him into tomorrow. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against the crisp notes he had taken out earlier for the riddle game. Smiling, he took a deep breath. What he had lost in rupees, he had gained 100-fold in insight. The city beyond the station was busy and alive, as if oblivious to the life-changing conversations happening within its confines. Professor Sharma stepped into the street, blending into the throng of people, yet feeling apart from it all, like a man who had discovered a secret treasure hidden in plain sight. He walked with a new sense of awareness, noticing the small details, the vendor adjusting his cart's umbrella, the old man seated on a bench with a newspaper, and a young couple deep in conversation. As he approached the university gates, the echo of the train journey stayed with him, its lessons reverberating like a gentle drumbeat. The conversations with the farmer had left an indelible mark, one that would shape not just the professor's teaching but his approach to life itself. For in those few shared hours, he had been reminded that wisdom isn't bound by books or degrees, it's bound by experience, perception, and the willingness to learn from anyone, whether they teach in a classroom or a field. The sun had disappeared by the time Professor Sharma reached his office, but the light it had cast remained in his heart. He settled into his chair, took out his pen, and began drafting a new lesson plan, one that began, "Once, on a train, I met a man who taught me about wisdom."